After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you. Hey, it's a pleasure to be back with you guys again. I'm so glad to be here, and I enjoy being with you all. And even though I know I stick out because I don't know to stand and sit down and all that good stuff. I've never been good at that, even in elementary school. So I'll be just fine. I'm delighted to be here today, especially a lot of fun to lead worship with Kieran, and that's certainly been a blessing as well. And you too, Mr. Barry, as well. So, Jesus did a lot of miracles during his ministry, but the only one of them that's mentioned in all 4 of the Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000 that we've been talking about. And one commentator describes it as a miracle of quantity, demonstrating that there's no end to Jesus' abilities. And in this passage, Jesus really overwhelmed the disciples and the crowds with his ability to provide the resources that they needed. Another thing that's interesting, we're in the Gospel of John, chapter 6. Another thing that's interesting about John's Gospel specifically is he doesn't use the word miracle. He uses the word sign instead. Now, I like to read fantasy and sci-fi and all that kind of stuff like that, and watch all those movies and stuff, as well as study, the history. You were saying you were in a mythology class this spring. I love reading all of that. And one of the things that came to my mind as I was kind of looking at this idea of calling them signs is they're trying to demonstrate, I think John's trying to make a point with the use of that word by telling us that Jesus doing the miracles didn't make him God. They just pointed to who he already was. If you think about Hercules in the Greco-Roman mythology, he had to do these 10 Herculean tasks to kind of get that divinity status. Jesus, of course, we know that's not real gods anyway, and we know those are stories, but still, even as our story is told, it's pointed out, doing these miracles didn't make him the Son of God. They revealed to us that he was the Son of God. So in John, in using the word sign, is not just saying, well, these weren't really miracles, but they were signs. He's really stepping it up the other direction. He's saying, these signs prove to us that he indeed was God. He was trying to reveal the identity of Jesus in his description of the miracles, not just tell us of the wonder-working power of Jesus. John is also stressing that Jesus' performance in these miracles did not make him a Messiah, but revealed that he was indeed the Messiah that was promised to the Jews long ago. And so one of the teachings that we can take away from this specific sign is, how do we live when we have abundance? How do we live in good days, when we have green pastures and good moisture and abundant crops? My maternal grandmother, my Grandma Pattison, now, y'all, I know how small towns are. I'm not from around here, so don't try to figure out who she is. I grew up in Oklahoma and Kansas, and but she would. Most of my family's from rural Kansas, down in southeastern Kansas, strung between Independence and Wichita, if you know where that is. And my maternal grandmother was born during the Depression, and her big concern, I can even remember it as a young child, was that we would all learn how to make ends meet, even during times that were challenging and were difficult times. One of her famous sayings was, if we have water, we have gravy. It might get thin, but we don't even need milk to make gravy. We'll just use water. But she was teaching us how to live during times of difficulty and adversity. And she certainly had seen her fair share of hard times and was determined that every one of us would learn to endure that as well. Now, Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, no relation to me and no connection with Kansas as far as I know, he was credited with saying, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you really want to test a man's character, then give him power. Give him some authority. I think Lincoln's wisdom applies to having things in abundance as well. We need to learn to live in times of abundance. We can maybe all double down or figure out ways to strap and make things get along, but when we have an abundance, we have a tendency to kind of let those rules cut loose. We don't worry about things. We let things drain off from us because we've got an abundance of resources. And we need really to learn how to better live in abundance. We live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We live during a very wealthy time in the history of the world. And even though maybe we may have trouble making our own ends meet, we know that our culture really is in a culture of excess and abundance, and we need to think about that. We're blessed by that. We have those resources at our disposal, and as much as my grandma was concerned with me learning to live without, believers in the States, we should really learn to live with excess. So how should we live when we live in abundance? I think in part, that's what John 6 is trying to teach us. Certainly to reveal Jesus' identity as God himself, but he's also trying to teach the disciples as he's training them and preparing them that, yeah, there's going to be hard times ahead, and you need to be able to deal with things then, but there's also going to be times of abundance ahead, and you need to be prepared to deal with that as well. The disciples, they've been traveling from town to town and really living on the generosity of the people. And this is really the first time when Jesus turns around and says, okay, you 12, you've been eating on the 5,000, now it's time for the 5,000 to eat on you. Oh my goodness, I cannot imagine the shock that they would have. And as we see this kind of unravel, I think we learn some things. And one of the things that I think we should learn is what Miss Susan mentioned a while ago. We need to learn to share. Now, I don't think, and I don't think she was suggesting this, I don't think that the way this miracle really happened was once this kid was willing to share his lunch, everybody else says, well, I really brought a lunch myself. You can have us a big potluck right here. And they threw it all. No. The text is pretty plain. They're out there. There's not much to eat. And only one kid had smarts enough to have a lunch with him. All right? I can guarantee you he was like me. He was the fat kid. He made sure he had a snack with him. All right? And he was willing to share that. Living in abundance means learning to share. If you look at verses, at the end of verse 8 and 9 and on into 11 and 12, Jesus talks about taking it and blessing it and breaking it and giving it. That'll sound familiar again as we get to the Lord's Supper in our liturgy and in our study in our year. And I think this idea of sharing needs to affect more than just our material goods as well. Nicholas, who's Leander and I's youngest son, many of you probably know him, Nicholas has turned me into a soccer fan in the last 5 or 6 years. And I've gotten where I really like the game. And I can even tell offsides now, which that's like the impossible thing to figure out in soccer. And I love watching really good players play. Every everybody from, well, both Ronaldos, Alexis Sanchez, Sané. I like the French team especially, so Pogba's a big hero, and all of them, Messi, the list goes on. But I'm going to tell you, those players are at their best when they actually share the ball, when they actually play with the team rather than try to do it by themselves. I think that's been the big bugaboo, if you know anything about World Cup soccer. I think that's been the big bugaboo for Messi. He didn't share the ball as well as he should, and so he felt such a weight to score for the Argentinian teams, he didn't push it off in the past as much as he should have. And all those players are brilliant and certainly are worth and able to run through everything. But all those players are greatly improved when they learn to share. I'm really kind of hard-pressed to think about a situation in my life or an activity in my life that wouldn't be made better if I would learn to share better. Share time, share energy, share resources, share compliments, share food, certainly. All of those things would be better. All sharing really is, and thus the soccer illustration, is learning to play well together. Learning to play well together. That's how this feeding story started. Jesus turned to his disciples in verse 5 and said, "Okay, boys, it's time for lunch. Who's buying?" Look at there in verse 5. Verse 5. Lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him. He must have had second-year math. He said, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each one of them to get a little bit. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, he probably wasn't really good at math. He said, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" And Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in that place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in numbers. So the families get counted. Not just the men, but the families get counted, represented by those men. And at this point, the disciples must have thought that Jesus was loony. They were obedient, but they wondered what Jesus would do. Jesus showed them. Let's just figure out how we're going to share what we have. Here is where the miracle of the loaves and the fishes come into the picture. Jesus multiplies the loaves. They have an abundance of food. Notice the food doesn't seem to be rationed at all. Well, there's a lot of us and we're only making so much, so you get 2 pieces of catfish and 2 hush puppies and a little bit of slaw, and that's it. All right? There's no... Probably wasn't catfish, unfortunately. That's not kosher. But you get the idea. They start sharing, and they don't worry about how much. Look at verse 11. They distributed the bread and the fish, and as much as they wanted, and then in verse 4 and verse 12, and when they had eaten their fill. When abundance comes upon us from the hand of God, we should not hoard. We should share. Now you can read through some of the rationalists, especially in the 17 and 1800s, where they don't really believe in miracles. They don't really believe in the supernatural. So there has to be some rational, humanistic explanation for it. They come up with all kinds of really plausible ideas, but I think ultimately bankrupt ideas that don't deal with the text. They say, well, what really happened is nobody knew, but they had a secret cache of food in the hillside there, and Jesus used sleight of hand to bring it out of this cave. So here's the disciples going back and forth behind the curtain, hustling food out there somehow or another. All right? There was no curtain. There was no sleight of hand here. Or they just meant they all had a sacramental meal. So it was like the Lord's Supper. They all had bread, but I don't know what you guys use for bread here, but we use these little things I call Baptist chiclets. Roughly the taste of wallpaper paste. And a little bitty, not even a shot glass, smaller than a glass. All right? I don't know how you get glasses that small. of juice. They just had a dot of the fish. They were just fed sacramentally. That's goofy because that's not what it says at all, is it? It says they were given as much as they wanted and they ate their fill. Or maybe it was some kind of hypnosis. Now, back to my fantasy sci-fi roots, it was a Jedi trick. You are full, you need no more food. Yeah, no. They multiplied the loaves. Right? They fed, they put it in Jesus' hand, and he broke the bread of life, he broke the fishes, and it multiplied. There was an increase in volume, is what I'm trying to say. It's about quantity. And they all ate, and they all shared. Another thing I think we ought to pick up from this in living in abundance is we ought to learn to be frugal. Now, look again at verses 12 and 13. And when they had eaten their fill, Jesus told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. They didn't waste anything. It was all gathered up, put in Tupperware, burnt good, and it was saved for later, for the next opportunity. That's what frugal really means. Frugal doesn't really mean stingy. It means using what you have and taking good care of your resources. Right out of high school, I got a job at a restaurant, a family restaurant on the east side of Tulsa, where I grew up, called Hardin's Fried Chicken. Now, we also smoked meat, brisket, and chicken, and pork ribs, and sausages, and bologna. For some reason, that's sold. I have no idea why. Smoked bologna. It's actually pretty good. And fried chicken, and all kinds of things like that. And I really learned a lot from Johnny Hardin, who was the owner of that. Johnny had a family restaurant in the Tulsa area since the 50s. And when Colonel Sanders was in his early days, before there were stores, he would go around and find family restaurants. And if he would go there and eat, and if he liked it and thought they did a good job with the restaurant, he would offer to get them involved in Kentucky Fried Chicken as a menu item on their menus. And he would teach them how to fry it, and sell them franchise, sell them the seasonings, sell them the machines, train them how to do it. And Johnny was the guy in Tulsa. Johnny ended up owning over 20 KFCs in the city of Tulsa. And in the early 70s, mid-70s, he sold out to KFC National and made millions of dollars and retired to Florida and hated it. And so he moved back to Tulsa and started a family restaurant again without the Colonel, and we had Hardin's Fried Chicken. But here was the genius that I learned from Johnny, right? Never watch what goes through the cash register. Watch what goes out the back door. Watch what we throw away. He knew that if we bought food and we prepared it and we sold it all and we had very little waste, that we were going to make money. Because we wouldn't lose any money on the food. We would make money on the food. And I was always amazed. I'm sure Johnny counted money at the end of the day every day. And I'm sure he knew exactly what was in that register all day long. But I'm going to tell you, he knew the contents of every trash can that went out the back of that door as well. And we just didn't waste food. Now, we didn't serve bad food, but we just made sure that we prepared our food in such a way that we could sell it and not have to throw it away. And I was just absolutely amazed by that. Actually, I was irritated like nobody's business like that. Because I got into trouble several times because I did something poorly and food ended up getting wasted. Right? But I learned from it. And I saw the value of that. If we worked, even at Hardin's, if we worked for 4 hours or more, we were given a meal. We didn't have to ask. We were just told to get what we wanted, to fix a plate, and don't waste any food. Being frugal means you take good care of what you've been given. Now here are the disciples. They're traveling. They're on the road. They're from town to town, and they don't carry a lot of stuff. And what happens here in verse 6? Jesus tries to test them. It tells us that he's going to test it. Jesus tried to challenge the faith of the disciples to help them trust him even more. I wonder if he didn't even chuckle to himself and think, they don't think I can feed a crowd with 5 loaves and 2 fish. How about if I feed an unlimited buffet to the whole crowd and then give each of the disciples a big basket of it to carry around for a while? By the way, the term for basket here is not a picnic basket. It's not a little basket. It's actually these large storage baskets that were used, that really weren't meant to be carried around. They were really meant to be put in one place and sit down to store stuff in. And now the disciples are stuck carrying these storage baskets. Living in abundance means that we should share. It means that we should be frugal. And I think also it means that we should be grateful. We should be grateful. Look again at verse 11. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to them those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And verse 14. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is coming into the world." Unfortunately, the tendency when we have an abundance is to begin to take credit for the abundance. We begin to see our success as something that we accomplished rather than realizing it's been a blessing from the Lord from the very beginning. I do believe that hard work is a virtue, but we should never deceive ourselves into thinking that we deserve a blessing or that we're exclusively responsible from the increase from our own work. Don't forget the parable of the rich fool, whose ground produced a good crop, and then he said to himself, "Self, what shall I do?" It's a good sign when you start talking to yourself. You better maybe move along or get somebody to help you sober up. "Hey, what shall I do? I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones." And what the Lord said, "Fool, tonight you're going to die. Then who's going to eat all that stuff in your barns and eat, drink, and be merry like you've been bragging about?" The parable reminds us that life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. And the parable ends with a little reminder that says, "So is the one who lays up treasure for himself or herself and is not rich toward God." Grace and gratitude are woven throughout the attitudes and the actions of believers. So when the Lord blesses us, what do? We thank Him. We might even say, "Lord, thank you for the help and resources to work hard that help produce this great increase." We don't have to run ourselves down and say, "Well, I can work as hard as I want and I won't make any money," or "I can work as hard as I want and I can make $1 million. We should just realize that work is part of the mix, but the increase is the Lord's. Grace and gratitude are woven throughout the attitudes and actions of believers. In verse 11, Jesus himself begins by giving thanks. And in verse 14, when the people saw the sign and they realized what it meant, they acknowledged that they had been fed by the hand of God. A meal which begins in gratitude ends in contentment. In contentment. Living in abundance means we should share, and we should be frugal. We should be grateful. This week, as we maybe think about and even celebrate the many blessings of God that we have, let us acknowledge the abundance in which we live and respond accordingly. Share. Be frugal. And thank you for doing it. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for loving us and caring for us. We thank you for the pleasure, the honor that we have to live in this country, to live in this state, to live in this town. And we see your abundant crop all around us, Father. Help us to share with those in need. Help us to be frugal with the things that you give us. And help us to remember the true source of all that we have. It is indeed you. Lord Father, give us, each one of us, an opportunity this week to share something. Maybe a word of encouragement. Maybe a kind word to a hurt brother or sister who's around us. Maybe a little bit of cash or a little bit of food to someone who genuinely needs it. Maybe a word of love or strengthening or encouragement or challenge to someone who's in need. Help us to look at our resources and be good stewards of it. And Lord Father, remind us always to tell you thanks first and foremost. Lord Father, help us as we pray as you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.